Plunging oil prices, sliding stock markets, 2016 doesn't be getting off to a great start with storm clouds gathering over the global economy.
Price of oil has dropped again.
Oil prices, they plunge.
Dropping price of oil.
So is it going to be a big, long, rainy season, or is there any light on the end of the horizon there? Well, we asked investor and financial commentator Jim Rogers what we should expect.
First thing you need to learn is don't listen to governments, don't listen to bureaucrats, and don't listen to politicians. They always say everything is okay. There were people who before 2008 said it was going to end badly. There have been people since who said it's going to end badly. So just start learning your own judgment, your own ideas, because the idea that the solution to more debt, to too much debt, is more debt and more spending is ludicrous. It's ludicrous that grown-ups would stand there and say something like that, and yet that's what governments all over the world have been doing. It's going to be worse than 2008, though. You're going to see bankruptcies. The debt is much higher all over the world now. Even China now has a lot of debt, which it did not have in 2008. No, I'm afraid you're going to see a lot of problems. Everybody's debt has gone through the roof. Money has been printed. Be worried.
The Dow fell by over 400 points when markets opened in the U.S. today, putting it below the 17,000 level for the first time since October. But the day's troubles started in China, after a new report showed China's manufacturing sector contracted more at the end of 2015. As a result, the Chinese markets had an even more alarming day, as markets closed prematurely after circuit breakers were triggered on that very first day that they were put in use as a safeguard against extreme volatility. The one-day index, the Shanghai Composite, fell dramatically by 7%, and another, the Shenzhen Composite, dropped by more than 8% before the circuit breakers were triggered. Fears of a crash in the Chinese economy then triggered massive stock sales around the world, making for an incredibly bumpy start for stock markets in 2016. And whether this is a sign of a looming economic crash this year is Dr. Richard Wolff, economist, professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the New School in New York City, and author of Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism, and co-founder of democracyatwork.info. Richard Wolff, welcome back.
But anyone looking at the world economy today, the abysmal conditions in Europe, the fact that in the United States the so-called recovery is really very limp, very insecure. Recent months have suggested it may go down again in 2016. And the rest of the world hangs on China. China, as everyone knows, is slowing down. Wherever you look, the news is dismal, the prospects at best mediocre. So if you're an investor and you look at all of that, then you don't need much in the way of a provocation to unload, basically out of a kind of panic, because once the unloading starts, in the crazy way stock markets work, they feed on themselves. So the smartest money gets out early in order not to be crushed in the panic that unfolds, and today was a perfect example. So I think all of the various factors, including this ban that expires in the next week, all of them play their role in a highly unstable, insecure global economic situation, except, of course, for the top 1%, who keep doing what they've been doing because it enriches them, even though it leaves the larger picture as unstable as today proved it to be.
Right. The other big excuse that was touted in the financial press today for China's falling stock market was that Chinese manufacturing is down, that their economy is still growing, but it's not growing at the 7 to 10% rate it was. And it seems to me that if China has become the world's factory floor because most of the developed world has bought into this free trade nonsense. Trans-Pacific Partnership, also known as the TPP, or SHAFTA as I like to call it. The president is expected to make a strong pitch in support of SHAFTA during his State of the Union address on July 12th. You know that we need to pass SHAFTA so we can counter the influence of China, et cetera. Here now to discuss the latest on the TPP, what we've learned since the text was first released, and how we can stop this disastrous trade deal from passing Congress, is Congressman Alan Grayson, representing Florida's 9th Congressional District. Congressman Grayson, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom.
It's great to have you with us again. Considering how bad we know this agreement will be for our economy.
Well, I think what's happening is that the Republicans in Congress are being trumped by you-know-who. And I don't think we're going to see a vote on this as long as Trump is ahead in the polls or heading in a direction where he might win the Republican nomination for president. He is extremely outspoken about this, and for an interesting reason. He understands better than many of his opponents do what the Republican psychology really is today. It's adamantly xenophobic, and therefore it follows adamantly against an agreement like this, for all the wrong reasons, by the way, but that doesn't really matter. Politics is politics regardless. So I think that you'll see a vote on this postponed until after the Trump candidacy is over. And this is in the face of big money, big business coming out strongly in favor of this every way that they possibly can, and passing around enormous amounts of cash in Washington, D.C. in the form of those legal bribes called campaign contributions to try to get this to a vote and get a vote through. But I think that the Republicans understand that this is an extremely unpopular initiative with Republican voters and knowledgeable Democratic voters as well, and they feel that it will fracture the party if they bring it up now.
You know, if this really was an effort to level the playing field with China, it seems like the first thing that we would write into the trade deal is that they can't play currency games with us. That's not in the trade deal. Why do you think that sort of thing wasn't included? Although I realize China was not a signatory to it, or is not at this point. And, well.
The answer is it would detract from the fundamental, primary, and almost sole purpose of this agreement, which is vast corporate giveaways. This is a corporate giveaway document from beginning to end. Every chapter is full of corporate giveaways. And if you actually put something substantive in it that might address the underlying concern, which is that we still have a trade deficit of $500 billion a year when gasoline is selling for less than $2 a gallon. If you put in something substantive in there that might actually do some good and address the trade imbalance, you'd be detracting from the ability to give corporate handouts to every multinational of any importance anywhere in the world.
It's really that cynical? It's really that crass and craven what they're trying to do?
I have not heard a single good answer to the question that you pose. It's a very good question. Why aren't we doing anything to address the trade imbalance? Specifically, why aren't we doing anything to address currency manipulation in the course of negotiating a trade agreement with entities that represent roughly 1/5 of world output or more? Why aren't we doing that? There is no good answer. The bad answer, the truthful answer, is that that would detract from this fundamental purpose, just give more and more and more to big money.
And the factory floor of the world is slowing down. That's not even a leading indicator. Isn't that a lagging indicator? Doesn't that mean that they're reacting to a slowdown in the United States and Europe, principally, and other parts of the world, sort of after the fact, or am I missing something here?
No, you're exactly right. And the way I put this is there's a kind of silly China bashing that's going on. The Chinese have made plenty of mistakes economically, politically, for sure. But China has to be understood as having achieved something extraordinary in the last 20 years. They went from a poor, backward agricultural economy to a modern, powerhouse industrial economy. And they did that by consciously becoming the exporter of, as you put it, the factory floor, the exporter of manufactured goods all over the world. They invited Western, including American corporations, to come in there under very advantageous circumstances, low wages, high profits. They allowed their own Chinese manufacturers to grow. They hitched their wagon, economically speaking, to selling to the United States, North America, and Western Europe. In 2008, that plan fell apart on them because they didn't count, as they should have, that capitalism has always periodically had a crash, and that periodically those crashes are really bad, like the one in 2008 has proven to be. So they built up all this capacity to produce exports for parts of the world that can't afford to buy them the way they once did. It was papered over in the 80s and 90s because of debt. Americans took on vast debt, Europeans took on debt, private debt, government debt, and that kept it going. But in 2008, the house of debt cards fell apart. And so now, with stagnant wages for the mass of workers and no debt to offset it, the Chinese can't sell their goods, and their whole economic system is premised on that. So when they slow down, it is, as you put it, a reflection of the inadequate state of the capitalist countries of the Western world, and now these two dilemmas feed on each other, which is why the prognosis for 2016 is indeed very scary, and while no one can predict whether the crash will happen, how bad it'll be in advance, it is clear that once again we face a global capitalist system that is frightening us because it's out of control in ways that are endangering the mass of people.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. As Albert Einstein said, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Dun dun. Remember that the next time you hear a genius demand yet more war. Stacey.
Remember, Max, in the last episode you mentioned Joe Scarborough, and I said nobody in the world knows who he is, so just let's move on from him. Well, sure enough, right after you said that, you know, some American ships wandered accidentally into Iranian waters, and Iran captured them for like a few hours. Well, here's a tweet from Joe Scarborough. Now, the important thing about him is not only does he have a morning show on NBC, which goes out to all of America, and many people watch it, but he used to be a congressman for the Pensacola region. So, hey, Iran. Oh, well, of course, they don't say Iran there. Hey, Iran, you have exactly 300 days left to push a U.S. president around. Enjoy it while you can. After that, there will be hell to pay.
This guy, Joe Scarborough, he's a presenter on TV, and he's trying to launch a war. I mean, I forget what the context was in the last show that we mentioned Joe Scarborough, but he is somebody that people watch and they have some kind of attachment to him as being an authoritative voice in some way. And yet he's just a monkey who's trying to launch a war for ratings. And see, this is the thing about America and the media and the war game that they're playing, is that in America, war means ratings. Remember, Countdown to Shock and Awe? It was a big ratings boost. They sold billions of dollars worth of ads on their collective wars over the past 10 to 15 years in the media space. For them, making a war is a spectacle to sell ads for, because nobody gets hurt.
Yeah.
In America's wars, except on a 9/11, it happened. They get blowback on 9/11, and then they say, well, it has nothing to do with the fact that we're disenfranchising or bankrupting or murdering millions around the world. It's an isolated event. We're still godlike, but yet Joe Scarborough will never cop to the fact that his rhetoric is causing the next 9/11 type attack in America. Thanks, Joe, you freaking irresponsible nutcase.
It also reminds me of those sort of, remember when we saw before the invasion of Libya, of course it was supposed to be just a no-fly zone and it was supposed to be about bringing peace, but in fact it was about bringing war. But we saw some presenters on Libyan television bringing guns and like hold it up and say, you know, come on, bring it on. You know, that sounds like that. And Louise Mensch, who is also a former MP here in the United Kingdom, also from the right-wing party. Joe Scarborough is a Republican. Louise Mensch was a conservative, Tory. And she was tweeting also, she's now living in New York, and she was like, airstrikes now! Airstrikes now! So, you know, this is the sort of mentality. If we saw this by most other nations, American media would be mocking the other nations where some loony bin is on television calling for airstrikes. Meanwhile, back in the United Kingdom, you know, where she fled, of course, which is a now tweet from Bloomberg, just in Britain's industrial output plunges by most in nearly 3 years. Of course, speaking of war, there has been a financial war here, and there's been a class war. So the austerity imposed upon the working class in order to pay for the financial war of the banking class. We've seen a collapse in industrial output. They're blaming the warm weather, of course, because people didn't use as much electricity and heating over the winter. So energy output did decline by 2%. But here we have the industrial collapse caused by a war here. Of course, it was from 1971, August 1971, when the U.S. went off the gold standard and the rest of the world followed, and it was on a global dollar standard that the Fed could have the ultimate weapons in controlling the global worker population, because there was nothing, they didn't need any real wealth, any gold behind their policies, and they could just abuse their population at will.
You don't need workers generating taxable income to pay off the debts when you could just go to Wall Street and print the money, or go to Washington at the central bank and print the money. So those at the very top of the socioeconomic scale don't need workers. They don't need people toiling for an hourly wage, because when they need money, they just go to the Fed and they give the money to them for free. So everyone else who's not got that open window of borrowing at 0% interest from the Fed is faced with the fact that their hourly wage in real terms has gone sideways to down for 30 years. And you can look at that and say, well, the productivity is higher. But then again, you could also look at a penitentiary and say the productivity at this prison is extremely high because these people are only getting 50 cents an hour. And look at all the output they're generating.
All the productivity gains went to the capital class, the class on whom's behalf the central banks work. So they were able to abuse them, the worker population, and hand it. We've showed that chart over and over, where from 1972-73, productivity continues to increase and wage earners, their incomes go down. So on top of this, we also have now this new, even more precarious population where everybody's on either 0-hour contracts or they're Uberized. Everything's Uberized. Is like you're on demand. Literally, you have no sort of leisure time at all that Keynes would have predicted. It's all like desperate looking for work. And this is causing even more trauma within the economy. Here's a headline from Australia. High-rise residents fight sharing economy over reports of pop-up brothels and all-night parties. The growth of short-term stays in high-rise apartments facilitated by companies like Stays, Airbnb, and other companies is seeing permanent residents living through all-night parties, pop-up brothels, and building damage caused by weekend renters. So this is in Melbourne. They're looking at it. They talk to people like one guy who, all those nice new apartment buildings going up, as you see behind us, you know, they're empty, but people are letting them out on Airbnb, and those who want to have a permanent, stable residence, they're being abused by pop-up brothels, drug deals, parties, like all sort of rampages going on next door, and there's no recourse. There's nobody to call. You tried calling Airbnb. There's no way to get in touch with any of these people, or, you know, it's trauma throughout the economy.
Well, this is a trend I've noted before, is that you have the two major trends merging. One is the subsistence work that is being ladled out to Uber drivers and other types of on-demand work meets the 24-hour online reality of our connected world, which leads to what I call the insectualization, based on the word insect. So, you know, when the queen bee of the bee colony is in need, the drones, you know, respond. Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to return to Lee Adler. He's a publisher of the Wall Street Examiner. Lee, welcome back.
Thank you.
All right, so Lee, former Dallas Fed President Richard Fisher recently said that the Fed front-loaded the market. Okay, so here's an exact example of what we're talking about. Here's a former Fed official. He's indicating the verbiage. He front-loaded. So once again, the Fed, in other words, pushed a lot of money into these primary dealers, who then made that cash available to the stock market to create a speculative bubble, right?
Exactly. Well, you know, this is not a surprise. In November 2010, when Ben Bernanke wrote his Washington Post editorial justifying QE2, he basically laid out the whole basis for the trickle-down theory, and that was that that QE would cause stock prices to rise. Now, he didn't get into the mechanism of how that was going to happen, but basically he said, this is what's going to happen, and then everybody's going to be happy, making more money, and there'll be more confidence and more spending, and the economy will grow. Well, of course, the trickle-down pooled at the top.
But in other words, here's my question. When the central bank decides that the economy needs more liquidity, and you have actors like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, Wells Fargo in this country, in the United States.
Yeah.
And they're recidivist, law-breaking scoundrels. all you're doing is you're giving them more money to commit more fraud.
Right.
Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a financial mafia. The banks are really, but it's legal. It's legal theft what they're doing. They're
they make the laws.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the people.
the
ISIS
process.
thinks that what they do is legal because it's per their laws.
Right.
Jamie Dimon thinks that what he does is legal because he wrote the laws.
There's a lot of illegality too that, as you said, doesn't get prosecuted because only the organization or the corporation is committing these illegal acts, but there's no people doing them, obviously.
Right, or they crash the market.
Yeah.
How many times, if I said to you that whenever the banks are getting close to being prosecuted for crimes, they simply crash the market?
That's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's a very good point. But at some time...
we saw that in 2008. Remember, they balked at TARP, $800 billion or whatever it was that they got, and they said, okay, they crashed the market, then they went back into the back room the next day and they passed TARP.
Yeah, but the banks have a certain degree of control, but eventually events spiral out of their control.
And that's the point you think we're at now?
We're not quite there yet, but we are heading there again. And this time, I think it could be even bigger than the last time. I think the Fed has used up its credibility bullets. People are looking around now and seeing, hey, this thing is starting to crumble after 6 or 7 or 8 years of central bank intervention, and suddenly everything looks very shaky. I think there's going to be a crisis of confidence down the road a bit, but the doubts are now creeping into the market. You're seeing it in the market action with the sell-off we've had the last few days, and I think it'll get worse.
So again, using this whole, we've been talking about the primary dealers and the central banks, they make money cheap. Corporations, instead of spending the money to build capital expenditures, instead of building out more infrastructure, hiring people, brand development, they just use the money to buy back their own stock to make their earnings per share look better than they would be ordinarily. Is that game about over?
Oh, I would think so. And it was easy money for them. They're buying back the options that they just issued to their own executives, and so that was a real game of hey, let's take the money while we can. So they did that. I think that we've seen the end of the so-called secular bull market, and we're going to go into a period where there are waves of liquidation, and some of these games are going to be cut back, and we're going to find who's not wearing any clothes financially. I think in 2016, it's going to be a year where we find out who's wearing clothes and who isn't.
All right. So finally, your work at the Wall Street Examiner. You're saying, the theme is the last Ponzi game standing is closed. So this would be the stock market.
Yeah, the U.S. markets in general, the Treasury market and the stock market, are the last Ponzi game standing. Some would argue that here in London might be the last Ponzi game standing, and I'm not that familiar with it. But
they have the least regulated markets here.
Yeah. So they get away with a little bit
they get away with the most.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, I think we're in a secular turn here where the doubts and the confidence that had built up in the central banks, I think, is beginning to wane, and that could lead to a huge crisis in the next year or so.
Okay, Lee Adler, thanks so much for being on the Kaiser Report.
The latest news headline, apropos of all this, just came out, was that TransCanada just announced a few hours ago that they're going to be suing the United States via Chapter 11 of NAFTA. They're alleging that the denial of the Keystone XL pipeline was purely political in nature and therefore a violation of NAFTA. 350org.org founder Bill McKibben wrote in a statement that, quote, "This isn't going to get the pipeline built, and it is going to remind Americans how much of our sovereignty these treaties give away." Isn't this a brilliant example, and shouldn't we be using this as a way to educate Americans about what happens with these trade deals?
Yes, perhaps the deepest flaw of all in the TPP is the fact that it establishes these tribunals that are open only to foreign corporations, not American corporations, not foreign citizens, but only foreign corporations. Gives them the right to get out of our court system, the court system we've used for 200 years now to resolve claims against the federal government, puts them in front of instead the United Nations and the World Bank. Imagine how Tea Party people would feel about this if they actually knew and understood this. Allows these foreign corporations to sue for unlimited amounts of money, sue not just the federal government, but every state government, every municipal government, every county government, and sue them whenever we enforce our own laws regarding the environment, the example you just gave, regarding safety, regarding health. Whenever we create a law in the United States or simply enforce a law in the United States that can hurt their bottom line.